Try this right now. Decide to believe that your parents are actually elephants. Go on, try. You can say the words, you can imagine it, you can pretend, but you can't make your mind actually accept it as true. And the reason you can't isn't because the example is silly. It's because belief just doesn't work that way. You cannot simply decide that something is true. And if that's right, if belief is not an act of will, then that has enormous implications, not just philosophically, but morally. So the question is simple. Can we actually choose what we believe? Let me be precise about what I am and am not saying. I'm not saying beliefs never change. Obviously they do. People convert, people deconvert, people revise their beliefs all the time. And I'm not saying we can't influence what we expose ourselves to. We can choose what books we read, what arguments we listen to, what communities we immerse ourselves in. What I am saying is narrower and more specific. Belief itself isn't a direct act of will. You don't decide to believe something in the same way that you might decide to raise your hand. You can decide to investigate a claim, but you can't decide to find it convincing. And that distinction matters. Think about what belief feels like from the inside. When you believe something, it doesn't feel like you manufactured it. It feels like you recognized it, like you saw something. Conviction feels discovered, not constructed. If someone presents you with an argument and it clicks, you don't experience that as a decision, you experience it as persuasion. And if it doesn't click, well, then you can't force the click. You might wish you were convinced, you might want the conclusion to be true, but wanting isn't believing. We all know the difference between pretending and actually being convinced. You can act against your beliefs, you can lie, you can say something you don't believe, but you can't simply will yourself into genuine conviction. Belief is closer to perception than to action. You don't choose what, say, looks red to you. You don't choose what sounds off key. You don't choose what strikes you as true either. Now this is where people push back. They say, but you can influence your beliefs. And they are right. We absolutely can influence belief. We can seek out counter-arguments. We can avoid opposing views. We can surround ourselves with reinforcing voices. We can approach questions with either humility or defensiveness. All of that shapes what we eventually find plausible. But influence is not the same as control, and that's the key distinction. We can choose how we engage with a claim, but what we can't choose is the outcome of that engagement. You can choose to, say, study the evidence, but you can't choose what that study will eventually persuade you of. And that isn't a weakness of rational inquiry, it's how rational inquiry actually works. If belief were directly voluntary, then persuasion wouldn't be necessary. We debate precisely because conviction follows evidence, or at least what we perceive to be evidence. We argue because belief changes through persuasion. You can be responsible for how you inquire, but you can't be responsible for what ultimately convinces you. Another common objection is this: unbelief isn't neutral. It flows from pride or rebellion or moral resistance. Now, it's certainly true that intellectual vice exists. People can be defensive, closed-minded, or biased. We are responsible for our, let's say, intellectual conduct. If someone refuses to even examine counter-arguments, then it could be said that that is blameworthy. But notice what that establishes. It establishes responsibility for how someone inquires. It does not establish responsibility for the final state of being convinced or unconvinced. Once a person sincerely engages the evidence, the resulting conviction isn't chosen, it emerges. If every instance of disbelief is simply interpreted as moral suppression, then there's no conceptual space left for sincere doubt. Every counterexample simply becomes hidden rebellion, and that may protect a theology, but it doesn't resolve the psychological question of whether belief is voluntary. A more sophisticated version of the objection says this: even if belief isn't directly chosen, it forms within a web of desires and values and long-term habits. So unbelief can still be indirectly culpable. And there might be some truth here. Our intellectual habits absolutely shape what we find plausible. But again, that locates the responsibility upstream of the actual belief. If someone consistently avoids difficult evidence, then that is a moral issue. But if someone honestly engages, wrestles, examines, and remains unconvinced, the mere fact of disbelief cannot be treated as a moral failure. Otherwise, we collapse the distinction between intellectual vice and honest disagreement, and that collapse would have pretty bad consequences. And now we get to the heart of it. If belief is not under voluntary control, then treating it as a moral obligation becomes really problematic. You can hold someone accountable for lying. You can hold someone accountable for harming others. But can you hold someone accountable for simply finding themselves unconvinced? Many religious traditions frame belief as obedience and unbelief as rebellion. But that moral framing only works if belief is actually chosen. If belief instead follows persuasion, if it is the psychological outcome of cognitive evaluation, then punishing disbelief becomes deeply difficult to justify. This is not about attacking religion, it's about moral coherence. If moral accountability requires choice, and belief isn't chosen, then belief cannot justly function as the basis for reward or punishment. That is not a trivial issue. It reshapes the landscape. Sometimes people worry that this makes rational inquiry pointless, but it really doesn't. It explains why inquiry matters. Beliefs change through persuasion, and we debate because arguments move minds. Recognizing that belief isn't voluntary doesn't undermine discussion. In fact, it clarifies its purpose. We don't debate to command belief. We debate to persuade. And persuasion happens to the mind, not by an act of sheer will. We can choose our actions. We can choose our honesty. We can choose whether we examine evidence fairly. We can choose whether we remain open to challenge. But belief itself? Belief arrives, or doesn't, as a result of persuasion. And once we recognize that, we have to think very carefully about how we treat those who remain unconvinced. Because if conviction is discovered rather than chosen, then the moral stakes change.